Good evening, everyone. Quite a crowd. Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, colleagues, students, esteemed elders, friends and guests. Welcome to the launch of Dhoombak Goobgoowana, A History of Indigenous Australia and the University of Melbourne, Volume 1, Truth. Let me begin by thanking Uncle Bill Nicholson for delivering the welcomes to country, your generosity in welcoming us onto your traditional lands which were never ceded, and the ways in which you have generously shared your knowledge, traditions and stories with the university community over many years, I acknowledge with gratitude and deep appreciation. The pursuit of a more just Australia at peace with its past requires us to confront truths that have been buried beneath generations-long discomfort and denial, arrogance and indifference. The fundamental importance of truth-telling and justice cannot be denied if our journey towards national reconciliation and meaningful political settlements between Indigenous peoples and settler Australia are to be successfully concluded with authentic national unity achieved. The history of this continent since 1770 stands as a stark reminder of the injustices that continue to curse and undermine our Commonwealth of Australia. For too long, the voices of the Indigenous peoples have been silenced, their rights suppressed, their lands and families taken away with little or no empathy or remorse, and with no legal remedy via just compensation. Race and racism have played insidious roles in attempts to eliminate Aboriginal peoples through open warfare and later through policies of protection, assimilation and integration. These actions, far from being a stain on our history and the collective responsibility of previous generations, today represent a glaring indictment of our collective decency. We cannot claim to be a just and equitable society while ignoring the systemic injustices that continue to permeate our institutions. As one of the oldest universities in Australia, an institution that stood at the front line of efforts to diminish, disregard and disremember the Aboriginal peoples dispossessed by the settler colony of Victoria, it is also our institutional responsibility to address the part we, the University of Melbourne, have played in the many injustices perpetrated against Indigenous Australia. The publication of the book we launched this evening represents the first critical action that forms a part of a larger institutional commitment to truth-telling and justice, as stated in Murrumuk Jering, the Indigenous Strategy of the University of Melbourne 2023 to 2027. Dhoombak Goobgoowana is a work commissioned by the University of Melbourne. However, it is important to note that this important contribution to our truth-telling and justice commitments is not an official history of the university. Rather, it is an independent scholarly work about the university. This book represents a turning point in the life of our university. It is a crucial and necessary step in our commitment to reframe our institutional relationship with Indigenous peoples in ways that are grounded in genuine partnership and collaboration, and grounded in the values of humility, commitment, accountability, respect, and reciprocity. The path to truth is not an easy one. It requires us to confront uncomfortable histories, to acknowledge our complicity in past wrongs, and to commit ourselves to a future founded on principles of equality, respect and justice. Neither will the institutional reset that is now required in response to the overlooked and ignored history made visible in Dhoombak Goobgoowana be easy. It will be hard. But the payoff will be more than worthwhile, and the intergenerational impact and benefit large. It is often said that recognition of Australia's frontier wars and the dispossession of Indigenous peoples is un-Australian and counter to national pride, national unity and even national identity. But I ask you, is there any act more authentic in its patriotism than to seek peace with the national past? Can we truly claim to be proud of who we are if we refuse to acknowledge the ongoing suffering of our fellow citizens, sufferings that are unquestionably the consequence of a history shared since 1770? The panellists you will hear from this evening are the editors of Dhoombak Goobgoowana, Distinguished Professor Marcia Langton, Dr. Ross Jones and Dr. James Waghorne, and I thank them for their extraordinary work. I also wish to acknowledge the vision and commitment of the university's past and current Indigenous leaders, and in particular Distinguished Professor Marcia Langton, Professor Ian Anderson and Professor Sean Ewan, who have long challenged and inspired us to confront the stain of the past. And I respectfully acknowledge Uncle Jim Berg, who is an important contributor to this project. It was Uncle Jim who first challenged the university and the museum about practices of collecting and exhibiting ancestral remains, and who urged the university at a 2019 symposium on place and Indigenous cultural recognition to acknowledge the need for a detailed history of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the university. We owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Uncle Jim. Uncle Jim, thank you. I also acknowledge Professor Richard James, whose idea it was to respond to the challenge of Uncle Jim in 2019, that we engage in a deeper truth-telling of our history through the publication of a scholarly work. Finally, I thank the Vice-Chancellor, whose unwavering commitment to confronting our past and telling the truth positions this university as unique in this country and probably unique in the world. Thank you, Duncan. Vice-Chancellor, I now invite you to launch Dhoombak Goobgoowana, A History of Indigenous Australia and the University of Melbourne, Volume 1, Truth.
Thank you very much indeed, Barry. I thank Bill Nicholson, Uncle Bill Nicholson, for his generous welcome to country earlier, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this university works and learns. And I pay my respects to Indigenous elders and leaders, past and present. And I commit this university to a long future of helping to educate and grow the leaders of the future. To all our council members, to Chancellor Hanson, colleagues, guests, friends, this evening it is my very great honour to launch a very important book, not just for this university, but I think for the country, and maybe even for the world, if that's not too ambitious. Dhoombak Goobgoowana, A History of Indigenous Australia and the University of Melbourne. This book has been long awaited by many people, both by those present here and by many others who are not present in person. As a university, we are conscious of our responsibility within the Australian nation of today and of our responsibility to future generations. A strong sense of these responsibilities has guided the work of compiling and editing the book. There's a double-edged sword when I say quite often that the university is foundational. It's foundational for the modern culture in which we live, but that also has implications in terms of its past and in terms of how it interacted with the people who were here in the first place before the university arrived. We have been here since 1853, but because we seek to build a strong foundation for the future through the quality of our education, our research and our ability to encourage critical thinking, I think the foundational word is appropriate for the modern age. We need to be an institution of outstanding scholarship, and in the course of being such an institution, we must be capable of critiquing ourselves. If we're not able to do the academic job of telling our own history in terms of our interaction with Indigenous people, then who is? So we must lead. I think that Dhoombak Goobgoowana represents all of these things. It turns attention to the long, complex and troubled relationship between the Indigenous people of Australia and this university. It is a book that will be painful for many who have long valued the reputation of the University of Melbourne. Dhoombak Goobgoowana will not destroy the reputation of the university. Not at all. What it does do is it reveals a troubling record of how academics have wielded power and justifies its use against Indigenous populations. It also reveals some of the disturbing ways in which knowledge, including Indigenous knowledge, was used during earlier periods of the university's history in connection with research projects and collections. Before now, the full story of this use of Indigenous knowledge has not been reflected in many biographies and institutional histories that often excluded race from their accounts of the university's achievements. And that changes with Dhoombak Goobgoowana. Volume 1 is a substantial work of more than 500 pages. I have to confess that I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I have read quite a bit of it, and it really is an outstanding work. And there is much more to come in Volume 2. It is impossible to single out any one section or one contribution as being more important than all the others in a work of this magnitude. It is in the collective work of contributors from Indigenous leaders to scholars, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that the power of Dhoombak Goobgoowana lies. I'll highlight the importance of the research included here that documents a history of eugenics and scientific racism at the university. This involves some famous names from the university's past and certain attitudes towards Indigenous people on the part of university students and staff that are at the very minimum regrettable and shameful. Certain parts of Dhoombak Goobgoowana certainly do make for hard reading. Yet I do think this is a step forward, certainly for the university and I hope for the nation. Australia today is very much in need of truth-telling about the past. Dhoombak Goobgoowana speaks to optimism and hope for a more honest and productive future by taking a critical lens to the work and past contributions of one important institution within the nation, our university, the University of Melbourne. I hope it will stand as a positive model of truth-telling about the past between Indigenous Australia and non-Indigenous Australia, one that might influence other universities in their thinking, and not just universities, but many other institutions too. I heartily congratulate the editors, Ross Jones, James Waghorne, and of course Associate Provost and Distinguished Professor Marcia Langton for their very fine work in bringing this publication to fruition. I thank everyone at the university and beyond the university for their work in bringing it about. And I, of course, especially thank the Indigenous elders and contributors who have been a key part of the process of publishing this book, and in particular Uncle Jim Berg, without whose challenge to the university to engage in a process of deeper truth-telling, this book would not have happened. I was at the research symposium in 2019, and what Uncle Jim said there had a very deep and lasting impression on me. So, without further ado, it is an honour for me as Vice-Chancellor to declare the launch of Dhoombak Goobgoowana, A History of Indigenous Australia and the University of Melbourne. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. I'm now delighted to introduce you to the editors of Dhoombak Goobgoowana, who have spent the last 3 years working on this volume, Truth, and the second volume, Voice, to be published later this year or early next year. They are Associate Provost and Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor Marcia Langton, Dr. Ross Jones and Dr. James Waghorne. Their bios can be accessed through the QR code on the postcard that you have received. This panel discussion will be moderated by Patricia Karvelas, who is a radio presenter, current affairs journalist and political correspondent. Her bio is also available via the QR code. Please be advised that in discussing the book, names of people who have died will be used, words and phrases used and topics addressed that are upsetting and disturbing, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you very much. And can I also extend my acknowledgement on the land that we are meeting tonight, and also Uncle Jim. I am really moved by you being in the front row tonight. I know everybody is, but your contribution in pushing this forward is an incredibly powerful one and should be. We should just pause and think about the role that you've played in pushing an institution like this. So before we begin, Dr. Ross Jones, I will start with you. You're next to me as well, which is perfect. You've been working on this scholarly publication for 3 years now. Can you tell us about the development of the book and what the many researchers involved were able to document?
I remember Jim very vividly at the research colloquium, and I remember the Vice-Chancellor, Duncan, walking out saying, "I want a history." And I'd been asked to go along and talk about the history of eugenics at the university because I'd written a lot generally about that topic, and the university had been large in some of my works. And about 6 months or 8 months later, Margot Eden and Richard James arranged a Zoom meeting with me. And I remember it because I was a little bit surprised because I'm not Indigenous and I thought it would probably be appropriate for an Indigenous person to do it. And I'm not a historian of Indigenous Australia. I read a lot in the area, but it's not my specific area. And I expressed my feelings to them and said, look, I don't know whether you've got the right person. And Richard James said to me, he said, I don't understand why Indigenous scholars should apologise to Indigenous Australia for the bad behaviour of old white men. He said, I want you to be my old white man. So I'm the old white man.
I love that you've just named that up front. The book does reveal that Melbourne University, I mean, it's a pretty confronting read, and I have read it, and it's an incredible piece of work. It is worth everyone's investment. It reveals that Melbourne University was the epicentre of scientific racism and eugenics in this country, and I found that rather confronting. Just tell me about how that is explored in the book.
Well, the other reason that I was intrigued by the request for me to be the lead editor was that eugenicists hardly in the 20s and 30s and from the war hardly talk about Indigenous Australia. Hardly appears in the literature. And of course the big secret is that is the dying race. They weren't interested in they were worried about migration, coloured migration. They began to be worried about, we said we gave you a warning, half castes and the language that they used and people like that. When censuses showed there was a big increasing population because they were supposed to die off, for God's sake, why didn't they die off? So you get someone like Frank Tate, who was a great hero of the working class, going to a coloured school in the US on one of his trips with Ken Cunningham, who was head of the Australian Council of Educational Research, Carnegie-funded, big organisation today. Ken was later president of the Eugenics Society. And he writes in his correspondence, a coloured boy came up to me and said, what are you doing for the education of your Australian natives? And his comment was, I was flawed. And that's the only comment. So the point is that what the attempt, I think, was, as much as Marcia has talked about the digging up of graves and other people have talked about a whole lot, my fascination with it was that there was this complete attempt to obliterate the Indigenous idea from the whole of the continent. And that then followed over when I started looking at I started discovering these people like Agar, who was president of the first the Victorian Eugenics Society that started in 1936. And today, James and I went and looked at the Agar Lecture Theatre, the W.E. Agar Lecture Theatre in the Zoology Building, which was named in 1990. And Agar was sort of...
let's just get a sense of that, 1990.
Yeah, when the new Zoology Building was built, or 91, I can't remember. Yeah, 1990. And there's a plaque up there for him. And he was president of the Eugenics Society. He was in favour of sterilisation of slum kids, alcoholics, prostitutes, as he called them, 100% male prostitutes, but most prostitutes, and full-blood Indigenous Australians. You know, he didn't say that, Berry did, but, you know, but basically they talked about the mentally deficient, which included all these inefficient members of society. And I thought, well, you know, there's something really odd. And then you go through and you look at Berry's ADB entry, which has been changed. I think they're offering both entries. But you go through and look at the Berry's entry, you look at a whole lot of other histories of these people, and it disappears after the Second World War, so it's gone. So there's another disappearance as well.
Professor Marcia Langton, I want to bring you in here. I mean, this is an unconscionable part of the university's history, but the university is now reckoning with its past and has taken a leadership role in truth-telling. What will be the repercussions of this leadership in truth-telling? How do you see it?
Well, there's a number of repercussions that I foresee, and already tonight Warwick Anderson, one of our great contributors, mentioned to me that people at the University of Sydney are regarding this book as the model for universities confronting their past. And I think, yes, as the first of its kind, it will be the standard for universities, and that's why I'm so pleased with, you know, the excellent contributions, because it, you know, it sets the bar high as a work of scholarship and thorough research, and you know, a willingness to confront some pretty nasty aspects of the university's past. So there's that. Secondly, and I think this is of great importance, is that I hope that this volume and the next volume will inform the university's anti-racism strategy, so that we get past the euphemisms and morning teas and cupcakes approach to anti-racism and deal with racism in the university in a robust way. At our last university leadership meeting, there was a session that we always have with our students representing their views to the leadership, and one of them had worked under the auspices of the Student Union to survey our student population on incidents of racism. And the report is just an absolute ripper. So the majority, I don't remember the numbers, but the majority of students had encountered racism of some sort, you know, especially particular kinds of students. And they were from, you know, every ethnicity, and it became obvious from this report that the university has quite a job to do, because racism is so normalised, you know, in the discourse of the university community. So that reminded me of how important it is to make sure that our anti-racism strategy deals adequately with the racism, because this university, and, you know, one hopes other universities, should be a place where all students feel safe and not subjected to racism or any other kind of discrimination. So that's the second repercussion of the project. The third is that if our teaching staff include the book in, and I'm thinking especially of our, breadth subjects, then students will, if they read the book and read it in a guided way, will be provided with historical facts about the past, which I believe very few schools teach students. And, as I said earlier at another meeting, if students come to understand the past, they might not throw around racist terminology and ideas in the blithe way that they do. And in teaching it, our lecturing staff would be similarly well informed about, the history of ideas relating to race and racism, and the special responsibility of university staff to teach the latest scientific ideas, which do not include the ideas of racial scientism, and which everywhere in the civilised world tell us that there are no biological facts that conform to the idea of races. So that's another repercussion that I think is most important. And lastly, I hope that the book will be included in the curricula of our schools, especially from grade 10 or level 10 upwards, and that future Australian students will have a much better idea of the history of ideas and the history of this university, so that they are, good global citizens and don't add to the burden of racism.
Dr. James Waghorne, the book makes reference to the university supporting injustices called progress, half-truths presented as facts, and prejudices pretending at objectivity. It's a pretty confronting sentence, particularly about what is kind of a leading educational institution, the most prestigious university, certainly in Victoria, but arguably Australia. Can you give an example from the book that illustrates one or more of these claims?
Well, yeah, I mean, that sentence is deliberately provocative, and it's meant to take a reader who might anticipate that a book about a history of the university, this is going to be a very different journey. There's a certain through the looking glass quality of this history that reflects my own journey as I work through this process, where I've come from a place where I revered the history of the university and I looked for the instances where the university achieved good things, or things that we might consider good today. And that was one of the important things about the university's history and what I could bring to it. But this history shows a different view, and it encourages readers to be a bit more critical about universities, and encourages them to think about the role, a bit more deeply about the role of the university. And I think that Ross's work on eugenics is particularly interesting in here. I think that Marcia's work on the Murray Black collection, both of which show shortcomings in what we would consider to be what a university ought to do. The thing that I think readers should reflect on most, though, is this idea of progress, and that progress is presented in this kind of inverted way, that people involved, that Frank Tate, for example, is presented as a progressive person, saw himself in that light. And yet we show how misbegotten, how unfounded many of his conclusions were. And Frank Tate is one example. There are so many throughout this history. I write about, for instance, Leslie Martin, who was the chair of the safety committee for the atomic tests at Maralinga. And you can see how individuals from the past fell short sometimes as well and should have done more. So in making that sort of confronting sentence at the start, it shows that it's a notice of intent, that we are going to be a bit more critical, and that through the looking glass, hopefully by reading this book, you can reconcile that view of the university with how you see the university today. And I hope that people across this institution also reflect on their own practices and take this as a challenge, that if you see yourself as contributing to public good and so forth, think about whether, in fact, that is what you're doing.
Wow, that's an incredible challenge. What was the most surprising thing to you that was revealed in this history?
Oh, I mean, I was shocked by so many things in working with this. I think some of the chapters hit you in the gut. They really are. You come away feeling absolutely repulsed by them. I think the Murray Black chapter moved me the most, actually, of the book. But I think the thing that I hadn't anticipated when I got into this project was the breadth. That we've taken this idea of the University of Melbourne, Indigenous Australia and the University of Melbourne, a history. And what we have found is that touches every part of this institution. So it's not just a story of the medical school, it's not just a story of the familiar stories that we've heard and we've read. We found our contributors, our amazing contributors who did all this work as part of their job, that's not their main task, we've shown there are connections with every faculty and graduate school. And just that breadth, I mean, this is why we have 2 volumes. That breadth did surprise me, and I think that's one of the powerful things that this book does present. It shows the connectedness of this university with Indigenous Australia.
Dr. Ross Jones, I want to bring you back in and talk to you about what, anticipating critics. Just anticipating, which I think I've got a pretty good radar for. I think critics may frame this as a revisionist history. Talk to me about how you've approached.
Well, I just want to thank Duncan Maskell, the Vice-Chancellor, for ignoring me for 3.5 years. And the point I wish to make is that this is, and I think Marcia and I have talked about this a lot of this scholarship's known. I mean, look, there are a few stories. I know I've read this stuff a lot, and and some of the things I guessed, but there are about 2 or 3 things in the book were real shocks. The Menane was a shock.
Could you tell me?
The Menane was a shock. The vet science who killed people and then got praised and got a scholarship named after him. That's Kate Audy's chapter. But the fact of the matter is, this is it's not an Indigenous history. I mean, it's a history, a university history looking at its relationship with Indigenous Australia. And we just went around and looked for all the holes. It's like a sort of repair job on a road. There's these giant holes everywhere of knowledge and we're filling them in. But we've known most of these stories, haven't we? And a lot of scholars here, a lot of you will all know the stories. They've been around for years. Jim's been banging on about the Murray Black collection for 20, 40 years. It's... some of these are really old stories.
Yeah, Jim's been banging on about it, but no one's documented it and meticulously written the history.
Well, Jim wrote a great book, wrote a great book, but it's just, it's about how people select what they write about. And as James said, universities, and especially settler colonial universities, but ancient universities too, like to sell a good story and they write good histories. And Carolyn Rasmussen, who's written 2 histories of the university, is working with us on this project. We've had a whole lot of, people, eminent historians who've written about this history, working with us on this project. It's not revisionist in the sense that we're saying, they're terrible. It's not, in fact, revisionist at all. It's fixing up the bits that were revisionist in some cases or that were missing. And we're feeling it's almost more like a restoration project than a knock-down, build again.
Marcia Langton, you in fact write in the book that, this is a form of restorative justice. Can you just explore that, what you mean by that?
Well, a good analogy is when a person goes missing for years and years, and or a person dies or is killed, and the family never find out what happened. Families all over the world search for years for their missing and loved ones, for members of a family who've been killed in mysterious circumstances, say particularly when bodies can't be found. And it leaves a hole in the family, and people just have a way of, so many families pursue these, cases for a very, very long time. And so, what these cases tell us about, and this came up, for me, I followed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. I'd met Mandela, I'd met many of the ANC members, and so I followed that. And again, in that commission, people just wanted to know what had happened to the disappeared. And that is why the amnesty was provided to those who came to the commission and, told the truth about what had happened to their victims. So those activities of human beings, that tendency of human beings to want to know the truth and to want justice for their loved ones, is very much an analogy for what we've done here. So, for instance, while I've read Uncle Jim Berg's books, for me, I had to find out, why did the university resist repatriation of the Murray Black collection? What were the arguments? What was the foundation for, the way that the university argued its case in court and refused to hand over the Murray Black collection? So I went to the archives with my good friend and colleague Louise Murray and Anthony Sinney, whose mum and dad and sister are here tonight. Hello. And we started, asking the archivists to find the files for us, and it was fascinating. There it all was, and we were able to cite the correspondence. And I want to thank our Vice-Chancellor, Duncan Maskell, who made it clear in writing when the Royal Commission, the Europe Justice Commission, was established, that the university would cooperate and would throw open its archives to the Royal Commission. And so the files are just endlessly fascinating. And, I won't go into detail because you can read it in the chapter, but, it wasn't just the lawyers, but it was actually university leaders who put, completely unethical, gobsmackingly perverse arguments to the court, and also in writing. So when you get that out in the open, that's the restorative justice. You can see how wrong it was, and that's what justice is about. So, that's just one example, and there are so many in the book, and, it's our job to have a look at our archives, to examine it all closely and, represent the facts as they're laid out there on the public record. Most of this, as Ross says, is on the public record and has been for a long time.
Professor Barry Judd, you're right at the end there, but I can see you still. I again, anticipating as I do what might be said about this kind of approach. You know, we hear language when universities try and embrace and institutions embrace a different path forward, that it's kind of part of a woke agenda and it's a rewriting of history. I'd like you to sort of confront that front on if I can. What would you say to those who depict work like this in that way?
They're wrong.
Well, that settles it.
This is a serious historical studies project written by A-grade historians and others, and the facts of history do not change. And that's pretty much my response. So I note that there's a story in the national media today about a colleague of yours, and we will get attacked and we will be called part of a woke agenda, because I think this country has real difficulty understanding that it is racist, and that various groups in Australian society, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people certainly, people from African descent, people from Asian backgrounds, experience racism in their everyday existence. And that is hard for people who are the beneficiaries of white Australia to understand. So it's an issue in higher education, I think. It's also an issue in the Australian Football League, an area which I know much more about. They struggle with accepting the claims of racism that footballers make every other week. Our university, however, has a responsibility to lead national and global conversations about race and racism and the legacy of past scholarly work, and this project does that. Speaking as a member of university exec and with a bit of a tradesperson's hat on, this work is also absolutely necessary for me to meet my current responsibilities in attracting and keeping Indigenous people at this university.
Well, talk to me about that, because the legacy, the historical legacy of this university is a huge barrier for Indigenous people who work here, isn't it? I mean, it's a hard legacy to get your head around.
It has been. I've got a double whammy at the moment. I'm a University of Melbourne person by day and a Hawthorn member on weekends. And
Look, I'm a Collingwood supporter, so I feel your pain.
It's a real conversation starter. Many of my Indigenous friends and colleagues will ask me, how can you work at the University of Melbourne and how can you barrack for Hawthorn? We do or have had an issue with our brand and the way we have been perceived by Indigenous people, and I think importantly this book project is, yes, it's about the past, but it's also about repositioning ourselves for the future, and in a sense I see this as step one to future-proofing this institution for an Australia that is based in not myth or lies but reality, a reality where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are and will be part of Australian society going on for the next, hundreds of years, hopefully thousands of years if Western civilization can hold it together for that long.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other panel, isn't it? Professor Marcia Langton, obviously the referendum was a key historical, well, it's very contemporary history, isn't it? But it will be remembered for a long time. But one of the things there have been calls for is a truth-telling process to acknowledge Australia's shared history. What role can the university come in overcoming some of the challenges of truth-telling? Because at a national level, we are at a standstill on truth-telling.
Well, it goes to this problem of scientific racism propagated by generations of professors here. So I'm not sure if it was Hawthorne, a Hawthorne recruiter, who said, Barry, that, it's best to recruit Aborigines who've got one white parent. Was that a Hawthorne?
Adelaide Crows.
Oh, Adelaide Crows. Okay, it's there. Because, they'll be better because they've got one white parent. That's scientific racism in action in the AFL, and we see many examples of it in the AFL. The present predicament of your colleague who's in trouble for saying something similar to what I said last year during the referendum debate. She said Australia is a racist country and it's so depressing. And I said in a little town in Western Australia that just recently got hammered by a big storm, that the referendum, the campaign for a no vote, was informed by racism and I think I said stupidity rather than ignorance, but anyway. And, if you look at many of the arguments from the no campaign, they're all, children of scientific racism. So I find it, for instance, at the moment, beyond comprehension, ironic in the extreme, that many of the very same people who were members of the Melbourne Club back in the day when Jews and Aborigines and other people of colour were not permitted to be members are now suddenly screaming about anti-Semitism and have no comprehension of the very role that they played themselves in peddling scientific racism in this country. So it's very convenient to be against anti-Semitism now. Why didn't they change the rules at the Melbourne Club when they had the opportunity? Are there any Aboriginal members of the Melbourne Club? Nope.
It would seem unlikely.
Nope, there aren't. So we heard students on our campus saying extremely anti-Semitic things because they are simply ignorant and uneducated about the kind of scientific racism that the Nazis used and which clearly informs their attitudes to our fellow citizens who are Jewish. And I also believe that this scientific racism informs the very ugly Islamophobic attitudes. So all of the non-white peoples who and other peoples who don't qualify for membership of the Melbourne Club and back in the day enrolment at the University of Melbourne are victims of the legacy of scientific racism. It was hothoused here at our university, and we now have a responsibility to clean that mess up and teach people actual science. The referendum, we lost the referendum because Australians, 61% of Australians believe that recognising First Peoples is an act of racism. It's not but that's, for another time. But in the first place, you have to educate people about racism. Why do you believe that there are races? I mean, Peter Dutton went so far as to say that our constitution's not racist. It is. And he peddled lies about our constitution. I don't believe that he hasn't read our constitution or had it explained to him. He's been in Parliament for years. And the no case rested on this idea that it was racist to recognise the First Peoples. Our proposition was not racist at all. Our proposition was the reverse of racism. It was to seek recognition of the First Peoples as a political act, as a constitutional act, to remove us from the category of race and to nullify the racist underpinnings of our constitution. I mean, read section 25, read the history of section 5126. Our constitution is racist. It was written in order to exclude Aborigines from the national fabric. That's why those two sections and deleted sections of the Constitution were framed, so that only non-Aboriginal citizens counted, and it was mainly about taxation, collection of taxation. But of course, they had the idea of including New Zealanders and Maori, and once it became obvious that, they hadn't killed enough of us and that the Aboriginal population still outnumbered the settlers, they had to stop this idea and exclude Aborigines and Maoris and, New Zealanders, therefore, from the Constitution so that whites were the majority citizenry. That's how it came about. We proposed an idea to overcome that racism, to make our status purely political. It's a fact of history that we were here first, and now 61% of Australians are completely bamboozled and I think poisoned.
So in that context,
by the no case.
This truth-telling process, what is the power of it then in that context?
Well, I had a chat with a no voter and I tried to explain to him that there's no such things as races, but racism is the problem. And he just couldn't get it. It was too difficult, right? It was just too difficult for him to understand. So that's why we have to tell the truth, because you can't have a citizenry that is informed by the most vicious ideas that human beings have come up with that has led to millions and millions of deaths, that underpinned imperialism, the Holocaust, and arguably, the Gaza-Israel war on all sides, and hope to have the kind of society that we imagine. We have to eliminate the evil of racism, and we have to teach people that races do not exist and racism is an evil.
Professor Barry Judd, this work is it's so thorough. I want to know what's next for the University of Melbourne. What does reckoning and redress look like in the context of what this book makes visible?
I don't know. What this book does is, I think, open up a space for a dialogue to now commence. This project is not like similar but different projects in the United States that are, I guess, commissioned investigations of histories. This project is an independent scholarly work. It provides, therefore, no recommendations about what we as a university community need to do next. I think that it definitely starts a conversation and does open up a space now for Indigenous members of the university community and non-Indigenous members of the university community to work together to figure out how we repair.
I'm going to open it up just to a couple of questions from the floor because it seems cruel for me to monopolise the questions like I have. So if you would like to ask, I think there is. Yeah, see, like I'm not looking out enough, am I? There I am.
Hello, panel. Yamariki Egan, Murat Barak. Thank you all for your words and contribution to the book. My question is that truth-telling in this context seems, because it's about the history, it seems like quite an ancient form. And so my questions are, what responsibility does the university have, and what opportunity do current Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff and students have to ensure that they can tell their truth with experienced racism at the university in today's age?
Well, I think we're doing a number of things to enable people to feel more comfortable in coming forward with their truths. Having said that, I think this is really important, and history plays a really important role in enabling other things to be done. Oftentimes when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students or staff have come forward, the focus has been on feelings. This book's important because it provides an evidence base to verify why people feel the way they do. So I think that's critical. In terms of current initiatives and pieces of work that are being rolled out as we speak, we have committed to a student barometer survey to enable our students to tell us how they're feeling on a regular basis. We are undertaking a piece of work within human resources. We've stood up a new Office of Indigenous Employment and Development, and part of their work will be to pull together annual get-togethers and workshops, if you like, of Indigenous staff to talk through difficult issues and build a better support network of peers. So that's happening, and I think our commitment tonight to stand up a truth-telling and dialogue centre as an academic project that will progress the work started in this publication is also important for documenting the truths of our people and potentially others. Does that answer the question? Thank you.
Look, I've already gone over time. I'm sure you all feel the same way. I could hear from all of these people for many hours, although we don't have many hours. Marcia, Langton, I'll ask you just one more question, and then, of course, Professor Barry Judd will wrap up. But there's another volume to come as well. And so this work is just starting. This is the beginning. Well, you've been working on this for 3 years, but in terms of the public-facing part of this is the start of this process. What do you see as the next part, as the next volume emerges?
Well, some of our colleagues have read parts of the book, and if they discover something that they didn't know about, they get very excited if it's in their field and they want to write more. So I think that this volume and the next one will incite many of our colleagues to write more. It's a bit like, these books are the icebreaker. I imagine it would have been extraordinarily difficult for young historians in the past and, staff at the university to speak back to this history. And that's why the book is now so shocking. Even though, as Ross points out, it's all on the public record, or most of it is, and we've all known about it for so long. So I hope that the book, just opens up a huge conversation in the academy, and our colleagues start writing about these matters. And, I really do think, given the present state of politics, that there's nothing more important for the academy than to thoroughly dispense with ideas of racism, and when people are racist, unknowingly racist, as most people are, because they believe in the, the great chain of being, because that's what they were taught when they were kids. They imbibe this around the dining room table, in church, at school. They need to have it knocked out of them. They need to be told it's false. We can't have an entire society based on a lie like this. I mean, I explain it to young Aboriginal people. They say, why are people so racist? I say, look, they swim in racism. It's like the soup that they swim in. Many Australians are so racist. Hey?
Sewerage.
Sewerage, yes, thank you. Many Australians are so racist that they don't know that they're racist. They just don't even know when they're being racist. It's like, huh? What? But they think what they're saying is fine. They can't see that it's racist. They don't understand it.
Well, anyone who's watched the news today would have seen the reports out of the Northern Territory in relation to the police there, and it just is sobering, isn't it, that that's still happening. Barry, I'll hand over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Friends, this concludes the evening. Thank you for attending, and please stay on for light refreshments. It is also, this is the most important bit of my duties, I think, tonight, it's also possible to purchase copies of the book, and the editors will be pleased to sign copies. Good evening.